Please welcome to the stage Antonio Zapula, CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation.
Hello again. Hello again. That was a great start to the day. Two very, very strong panels discussing the many implications of AI. And now really it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, one who knows the real value of trust, which is the theme, obviously, that runs through both the days of the Trust Conference. In 2020, Frances Haugen accused Facebook of putting profits ahead of safety. The company was accused of not doing enough to curb misinformation and to safeguard its users. Her disclosure of thousands of internal Facebook documents to the US Congress sparked an international outcry. I really would like to hear her thoughts, especially understanding how the Facebook files that we all have read about can inform our approach to AI, because transparency and accountability, as we know, are essential to building trustworthy technology, as has been widely discussed today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Frances Haugen.
Hi, good to see you. Hi. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good. So one of the things that I often see at conferences like this is there's a lot of really good panels, really good speakers, but over the course of like each day of the conference, like sometimes like the energy level of the crowd will like get a little bit lower and a little bit lower, because like we're talking about really heavy topics. How many people feel a little bit overwhelmed these days about like where technology is going, social media, AI? Like, does it feel like a thing where it's like an impossible thing for us to like be able to tackle? Yeah. Even those who didn't raise their hands, I know there's a little bit of that darkness in your heart. You know, it's these things that weigh us down. I think that's a totally reasonable sensation, right? Like looking at the magnitude, looking at things like one of the quite reasonable arguments is they say technology is moving faster every single year. Like you can go back, start looking at 1900, look at all the way to today. We adopt technologies faster. They penetrate into markets much quicker. And we're living with some of the consequences of the fact that adoption is so much faster. You know, if we looked at something like the telephone, it took, I think, on the order of like 60, 70 years for it to get to like 80% penetration in the United States. When we look at things like cell phones, that window is down to like, under 20 years. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this idea of, well, if technology is accelerating and we need to be able to respond faster, like why, and like where does this feeling of powerless come from? Because I want to just do a little bit of baseline setting. Actually, I have a quick question. For whoever's in the AV booth, can you make my timer go? Oh, perfect. My timer needs to count down because I'll stay up here all day otherwise. Because I love talking about how do we drive change. So like, I'm a little bit of an anomaly in that I am an electrical engineer by training, but I had a minor in Cold War studies. I really like history. I did a big focus on civil disobedience against things like nuclearism. I'm really intrigued about the story of the 20th century for me, the story of the Cold War, was seemingly impossible things kept happening like over and over again. Right? So like when we feel overwhelmed and we're like, hey, we have these oppressive forces in the world, they're so powerful, we're so small, like I want you to roll back in time and ask yourself questions like, hey, if we were living in 1880, so, we are in London, which is like the center of the world in 1880, how many people in the world thought the British were going to leave India? Right? No one did. Like that was crazy. The sun never set on the British Empire. There were 72 crazy Indians who held the first Indian National Congress. They were like, no, we are going to be free. And 70 years later, they were. Or let's roll back in time, 1960. How many people in the world thought the Soviet Union was going to fall? Like basically no one did. But there were these little holdouts. Like one of the people who actually kind of kept the faith said no, there's more in this world. I believe the world can change. was a playwright and a poet named Václav Havel. And he had this realization, which was when you live in an oppressive system, the number one thing that system wants is for you to not have hope, right? Because if you don't have hope, you will not figure out how to get out of that system. And he said, one of the things that we can control, no matter what the circumstances are that we are living under, is we can take care of each other and we can live in the truth. When we see things, we can speak honestly about them. We can start saying, I don't think this is fair. Or we can just start being honest with our friends and neighbors. Because that scaffolding is how we maintain our energy. It's how we continue to push forward. 1970, how many people thought apartheid was going to end? Almost no one did. All these things were seemingly impossible. They were huge, huge forces, far more oppressive than anything we'd experience today. So then why is it when we talk about technology, we feel the same level of dread, where we're like, there's no way we can change these things? And I think a big part of that, because like I said, I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we change? How do we change our circumstances? Because to be clear, the stakes are really, really, really high. So when I came forward, the reason I came forward was Facebook had been telling the public that the way we make social media safer is we take down bad things. We can do it. They're like, we can do whatever we want. The most important thing, though, is let's take down the bad things. And they declined to clarify with people that when we put safety in kind of as an afterthought, when we take down those bad things after they've started to get picked up by the algorithms, we have to rewrite those systems language by language by language by language. How many languages are there in the world? Do you have any guesses? Okay, how many people, let's start. Who thinks there's more than 100 languages? Okay, who thinks there's more than 500 languages? Who thinks there's more than 1,000 languages? Who thinks there's more than 3,000 languages? There's between 4,000 and 5,000 languages. And then there's way, way, way more dialects. My husband likes to joke, the difference between a dialect and a language is, do you have an army? If we go to places like India, so he's doing some work around voice to text, particularly with health workers. So community health workers in India are basically really smart grandmothers who often are illiterate, who, when you bring them your sick baby, they're like, that is a really sick baby. You need to get on the bus for 2 hours and go talk to the nurse. So people have said, wouldn't it be cool if we could do voice to text so that people can, we could actually, take notes, they could ask questions, get answers. It turns out in some places in India, you get a different dialect every 25 miles. Facebook told us we could have safety by taking down the bad things, but they declined to tell us that these AI systems are so brittle that even little dialectical differences can make the systems break. Right now, we are living in the echo just of events that happened last week that really highlight how much this matters, how big the consequences of this are, and that there was a referendum in Australia around giving a voice to the Indigenous population. And this effort everyone thought it wasn't going to be a very big deal. Even the Conservative Party was supporting this referendum, say 4 or 5 months ago when it went on the ballot. It's non-binding. It's like an advisory panel that gives opinions to Parliament. Parliament can ignore them. This shouldn't have been controversial. And yet, over the course of the last 3 months, it has become incredibly polarized, incredibly angry. Hateful slurs, racial hateful slurs, exploded on the platform. And a big part of this was that groups outside of Australia started weaponizing the platform, and Facebook didn't take into consideration the idea that Australian English is not American English. I'm willing to disagree about hateful content. Hateful content is actually very hard to take down. Right? This is another thing that Facebook didn't talk about. when we want to say, is this post hateful, is this post not hateful, there's a lot of context, a lot of nuance. Going back as far as 2018, Facebook has been very, very open with the public about the idea that because language has that nuance, you have to make huge trade-offs between will you get all the bad things, or will you take down stuff that was innocent, right? But slurs is like the floor, right? When we use really profoundly offensive slurs, that's a pretty easy thing to find. Computers are good at that kind of task. What we found in the case of Australia was that because Australia is enough different than the United States, enough different than the UK, indigenous groups had been saying for months before the referendum, could you please give us just parity with the United States? If you use the equivalent slurs in the United States, they would have gone taken down. Can you just give us parity on slurs? And Facebook didn't even acknowledge them until a week ago Monday. It's like 5 days before the referendum. Okay, so we live in this world. Facebook has told us, the only thing that can keep us safe is content. Part of why we feel like we have no options is because when we talk about how do we make social media safe, we still work within the frame of reference that Facebook has been promoting for 10 plus years. They've said, hey, you have this inherent conflict between safety and freedom of speech. When we think our only tool is taking down the bad things after the fact, we feel powerless. Because people who care about civil liberties, when people understand consequences of like what happens when we infringe on freedom of speech, freedom of ideas, they're like, oh, I guess I can't reconcile these. But the reality is, and this is why I brought forward 22,000 pages of Facebook documents, was that Facebook has known for years that the design of these products has a far bigger implication on what content we see. That they make lots of small choices, they turn dials, sometimes in subtle ways, and it radically changes the content that we see. Part of what I hope you guys leave here today with is the idea that we can start being honest with each other about what problems we want to solve and start accumulating together collectively what are the different ways we might solve those problems, because that lets us expand the conversation on how to move forward. So my nonprofit is called Beyond the Screen. We started last year. One of our core projects is based on this idea of like, how do we begin to realize we don't have just one tool, content moderation, a tool that doesn't respect the linguistic diversity of the world, that's brittle. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of different little dials we can change. The question is like, how is it that we actually begin having that as shared knowledge? How do we actually start thinking about how to build those solutions? And a big part that we've been trying to address is the idea that people who understand social problems often don't necessarily understand all the options for solving those problems technologically. And so later this year, hopefully, we're trying to aim for a December release. We're going to be opening up to partners, and I hope you'll reach out to us if you're someone who's working in the space of social media safety, online safety. Because we're going through and building a taxonomy of harms so we can start living in the truth of like, what is the reality of these platforms? We're going to start building a taxonomy of what are the levers for solving these problems? Like, what are the areas of opportunity to either prevent or mitigate harm? And the reason why we're doing that, it's like, Francis, aren't you being a little pedantic here? Like, why do we need to like separate out a lever from like a tactic for pulling that lever? Like, aren't you getting like lost in like the nerdy data weeds? Which is true. I do like structured data. But we think there's an opportunity there. For those of you who follow along with the kids' online safety conversation, one of the things that I see over and over again is that people will confuse a lever for a single tactic for pulling that lever. So in the case of online safety, The most impactful lever that you see again and again across problems is let's keep under 13-year-olds off of social media. Like the data is very clear. When kids are going through puberty, this is like 10 to 13, their brains literally start changing and they get more oxytocin and dopamine receptors. That means that no one in this room is ever going to get a compliment as sublime as a compliment a 12-year-old girl gets. No one will ever get a criticism as devastating. I think we can all agree that's a good thing, right? I don't want to be 12 again. But people will come back and say, okay, so we need to keep under 13-year-olds off these platforms. You know, we check IDs for bars. If I got like $1 for every time I've had to have a conversation with a governmental leader about like, why can't we just check IDs? I would not be like begging donors for donations. I'll put it that way. You know, it sounds obvious. It's like we check IDs in lots of circumstances. Why can't we check IDs online? The reality is checking IDs doesn't work. I can do a 20-minute tech talk for you. I don't think we have time right now. And it freaks people out. So in the United States, checking IDs is a deal breaker. And the platforms know it. Like when we brought up the Kids Online Safety Act in California just a couple months ago, it shouldn't have been a big deal. It already was in place in California, in the UK. It wasn't going to change the internet that much. And literally the platforms were going around to elected representatives and saying, we could do this, but then we'd have to check IDs, right? Imagine a world instead where we said, hey, let's bring together people who understand social problems. Let's bring together technologists and say, what are the ways we could find under 13-year-olds? Because when you bring together those two populations, suddenly you realize there's lots of possibility. There are at least 10 or 15 different ways to find an under 13-year-old. It's everything from kids are not that bright, and they'll say things like, I'm a 4th grader at Jones Elementary. You can find lots of Instagram profiles that say this. To kids report each other to punish each other. So you were mean to me at recess, you're losing your Instagram account. And probably you'll retaliate and report me too. That's the nature of being young. Once you find 1,000 or 10,000 kids, we have so much data online that we can find all the others. We don't have to check IDs to keep under 13-year-olds off these platforms. I think if we could all sit around a table and look at all the tools we had available, we wouldn't feel overwhelmed. I think a big part of how we're going to move forward, and I promise the people in the booth whose time is flashing at me, I will wrap up in just a second. I think if we all could sit around a table and say, let's be honest with each other, let's live in the truth about what the harms are, like let's just admit what they are. And if we could sit around and say, hey, we have 1,000 different options, I bet there's a floor that we all are comfortable with, right? I'm not saying do everything. I'm saying like right now we're down here, this is what's possible. There's probably something down here where we'd say that's the floor. But my hope is that a year from now or 2 years from now, we look back and we say, we learned something in the process of making social media accountable. We learned for the first time, how do we, at scale, bring more and more diverse people into the conversation? And how do we facilitate conversations around what the floor should be? Because we will use this again for AI. We will use it over and over again as we tackle new kinds of technological problems. And so, thank you so much for inviting me today, and I look forward to conversations with you all in the future.